So I want to tell you a little bit about what my motivation was going in and what I thought I was doing, and then we'll talk about what happened. And then we can talk about Orange is the New Black, because I did in fact just meet one of the actresses from that show completely accidentally in downtown Philadelphia. I'm sure you're all waiting for that story. I know. So in part, this book starts because I wanted to write a more positive book, one that was looking at new directions in the system. So we have this phenomenon of mass incarceration, which is becoming obvious to social scientists in particular and to people in the system, certainly by the mid-1990s. And sociologists as a discipline have sort of earned the reputation, rightfully earned the reputation, of being a little bit of a negative Nancy, in that we are extremely good at going into an institution or studying a set of institutional policies, identifying all the problems with those institutional policies, tracing out all the negative consequences, and then packing our bags and going home and writing it all up. What we don't do often enough or well enough is talk about what's working or how it can work or how we can improve our situations. And it's now sort of a standard stock criticism for dissertation committees, for book reviewers, article reviewers. What are the policy implications of your work? So you told us what's wrong. What are we supposed to do to make a workable solution? So I thought, I will go into a prison and I will identify what it is that we ought be doing. I'm going to sort of turn this thing on its head and try to look at a path that would be more positive than just straight incarceration. So I go into the system in the mid-1990s. And what was happening in the mid-1990s that now has earned its own name, which is mass incarceration, is this explosion in the prison population. But just to give you a sense of the landscape, when social scientists refer to mass incarceration, they're talking about more than just the numbers. They're talking about major structural changes to the system, the prison system itself. So mass incarceration encompasses at least 5 different components. First, of course, is the size. And so in the mid-1980s, when politicians are talking about the crime problem and the prison problem, our prison population is 300,000. It's 300,000 American adults who are in a state or federal prison facility. And everyone thought that that was outrageously high. Today, that number is just over 1.5 million. And I'm not including in that statistic people who are in jail, people who are under some form of correctional supervision like probation or parole. If we look at all of those people, we're at 7 million. And what often isn't talked about in that number is women. But for comparison's sake, in 1980, there are about 15,000 women, adult women, incarcerated. In 2012, there are 113,000. So the prison population explodes, and explodes on both sides, on the men's side and the women's side. The second thing that social scientists are referring to when they say mass incarceration involves the rate of incarceration. That is how many US adults per 100,000 are incarcerated. And so our incarceration rate is just around 500 adults per 100,000, which makes us a global leader. It's historically unprecedented. We incarcerate more than South Africa did during apartheid. Their rate was about 400 per 100,000. So we are well beyond that. And again, if we break it down and look at gender, what we would find is from roughly the 1980s through 2003, sort of the height of the drug war, the rate of incarceration among black women increases by 800%. So today, black women's incarceration rate is 142 per 100,000. White women's is about 50 per 100,000. Third component of mass incarceration. I feel like I'm in my punishment class right now. I'll just get this out, and then we'll talk prison stories. Third sort of structural component and change is the type of sentences that people are serving. So beginning in the 1980s and moving forward to the present day, people are serving much longer sentences, considerably longer sentences, for a broader range of crimes, but most notably for drug crimes. And so in the state that I studied, a state whose official name has to remain anonymous because yours truly is trying to avoid a massive lawsuit with this book, that state, about 4% of their prison population in the 1980s was consisted of drug offenders. By the sort of turn of the century, it's 20 to 25% drug offenders. So you can see really directly that these massive increases are primarily born by changes in sentencing laws around drug crimes. Fourth component of mass incarceration refers to racial and ethnic disparities in the system, and this I'm assuming you're all reasonably well versed in. So, for example, 1 in 20 African American men over the age of 18 is under some form of correctional supervision, compared to 1 in 180 white men. Both white men, black men, white women, black women experiences increases in their incarceration rate over that 30-year period, but it is particularly pronounced among African Americans. And that has to do not with African Americans' participation in crime. We've all traced that out. Criminology has done a great job looking at those increases and trying to figure out if it's explained by the black crime rate. It's not. It's a function of law enforcement policies in black neighborhoods and sentencing policies associated with the drug war. Fifth component, and this is the one that I started to zero in on in the book, is harsh conditions, increasingly harsh conditions in our prison system. So what you see certainly by the end of the 1980s is this language of get tough. And so what's wrong with the system, what's being diagnosed at sort of politically and in political culture is this notion that our crime is increasing. It wasn't, but we were all still acting as if it was. Our crime is increasing because prisons are too soft, because rehabilitation doesn't work. And so what we've got to do in prison is send people there for longer periods and make it a harsher experience. So we get rid of rehabilitation as a goal. And you see just the sort of massive removal of drug treatment programming, educational programming, vocational training programs. And instead it's replaced by increases in the use of solitary punishment, the rise of the Supermax facility where people are kept on 23-hour lockdown with 1 hour a day, often in an exercise yard alone. And in fact, a lot of the men's maximum security institutions I've been in started implementing these. Have you been to a dog kennel? Those like little dog runs at the end of the kennel? That's what they were putting men in for their 1 hour of rec time. It was like the equivalent, it was a cage. They were in it by themselves, and all they could do was sort of, it would be, the average cage was probably, if you started here, about to midway back in this room, and about this narrow as a channel. So prisons changed. They became more austere places and grimmer places. And so there's a lot of attention that's paid to what's happening, but it's being paid among social scientists, but it's being paid to what's happening in the men's system. So we know that there are new men's prisons being built. At one point, it was averaging 1 new prison a week across the country. But there is absolute silence with respect to what is happening to women offenders. And yet we know from looking at the numbers that women are caught up very directly in this as well. Because what drug sentencing policies did was tie judges' hands behind their backs. So if you are convicted of a drug crime, your sentence is determined by the weight of the drug, not by your role in that crime. So whether you're a buyer or a seller or an intermediary, or you've just rented out a room in your apartment so people can shoot up or smoke, you go down for the volume of the drug. And so that is what directly contributes to the profound increases in the number of women who are in prison. By the way, the number of women in American prisons is also itself historically and globally unprecedented. No country in the history of Earth has locked up as many of its women as we have done and are continuing to do. So I'm reading the literature on what's happening on the men's side and wondering if that's the same phenomena that's happening on the women's side. And there are, gender scholars, there are really sort of great theoretical questions to ask here, because certainly in this moment in time, there are calls to get tough, and there's questions among gender scholars about, do institutions treat men and women differently? Are assumptions about men and women different, and then that structures different institutional policies? We know that, at least when it comes to sentencing, men and women are treated under drug sentencing laws. They're treated identically. So I was wondering if women's prisons became austere like men, if they started implementing all these security measures and lockdown and solitary confinement and all that kind of stuff. So it was a set of theoretical questions I had. But then I was also sort of just mindful about the discipline itself. So the prison that I choose to study is a prison that in this moment seemed to have sort of 2 beacons of light associated with it. The first was that staff, administrative staff, as well as line staff like correctional officers, counselors, at this prison were really, really, really balking at the idea that they should have to get tough with women prisoners. And the reason that they balked at that idea and they rejected that idea was that they felt that women's needs were different than men, that women commit crimes for different reasons than men. And so they were really rejecting a lot of state pressures to adopt all sorts of hardened security measures. So the state would come at them and say, we want you to put razor wire on the fences, you've had some escapes. We want staff to carry mace. We want to use restraint devices. And the line staff at these institutions would really reject it almost wholeheartedly. There were very few supporters of that kind of stuff on the premise that women are different. And so I thought, well, that's interesting and probably progressive. And secondly, this prison was moving out of lockstep with the rest of the country because what they were trying to do was find a drug treatment program in the midst of this that would work. They wanted women who were entering that institution to leave it better off. And so they were diagnosing the increase in the number of their prisoners as being directly related to the drug war. They didn't see it so much as a function of sentencing policy. They thought more women are doing drugs, more women are developing drug problems, and so let's try to do something other than lock them up. Let's put them in a drug rehab, dedicated drug rehab program within this institution, and maybe that will reduce the likelihood that they will relapse when they get out or that they would be involved in drug crime when they get out. And so that's what I set off to study, because I think that as I'm going in, I'm thinking if this works, it's going to be this sort of great book and an influential book in a sea of kind of negativity. So all these other studies are looking at how total confinement and solitary confinement fail and how our current policies fail, and then I'll have this like little beacon of hope in the midst of it, and we'll have a direction that we can move in. It was probably the last time I was optimistic in my life. That was a good 15 years ago. So that's not the book I wrote. And what I thought I'd do today is tell you some reasons why that's not the book I wrote. Here's how the study goes down itself, just to give you an overview, and I can talk more about this. And it's also important that somebody tell me when it's time to stop talking, because as we all know, I love to talk and to hear myself talk. But I appreciate you talking too, so I'm going to leave time for that. So this is an ethnographic study, and it means that I go into the institution, that I want to see what's happening with my own eyes, and I want to talk to people as it's happening, and I want to be able to ask them why they're implementing the policies that they're implementing, how they feel about those policies, like whether or not they're challenging the policies. So I want to see it for myself. So I go into the system in the mid-1990s. I'm there for 4 years, and I'm usually averaging about 15 to 20 hours a week. I had high-level security clearance, so I was in meetings with top-level administrators in the prison. I was out in the yard with inmates. I was part of therapy groups. I was in the cafeteria a lot, the law library, you name it, I was there. And over the course of that, so it's like participant observation data, I also interviewed just under 100 people, inmates, correctional officers, administrators, politicians, drug court judges, and most of those people I interviewed more than once over the course of the 4 years. And then finally, I went back 2 years later after the end of the study and did follow-up with people, and I did follow-up in the prison, and then I did follow-up on the streets. And some of those people I'm still in contact with on the streets, which if you've had my class, I periodically take phone calls from them during class, which are often so vivid. Anyway, all right, so here's the problem. There's sort of two problems that emerge very, very quickly when I get into the institution, and the problem is really centered on this drug treatment program. So let me describe this program to you very quickly and the context in which it emerges. So the state built a new prison for women, a big new prison for women, because the old prison was overflowing, like to the seams. So they build a brand new prison, they make it really big so that it can absorb whatever increases there are going to be. And within 2 years of building that new prison, they're over capacity. They're over capacity, and they are facing now multiple inmate-initiated lawsuits for overcrowding, which is an Eighth Amendment violation. Everybody in the punishment class, cruel and unusual punishment. And the DOC, because the DOC's budget is busted, the DOC is saying, we can't give you any more funding to build even an additional wing to your prison. You've got to figure this out. So administrators are under a lot of pressure. The state is telling them, we think that your increase in your population is a function of recidivism. These women go out, you coddle them when they're in, they go back on the street, they commit more crime because you haven't been harsh, so you need to ramp up security measures and you need to make this a harder place for them to do time in. So that's the pressure that administrators are under. And in this moment, when they're under tremendous career pressure and they're facing lawsuits, along comes a private company. It's a private company that is charting a different path for itself than other prison vendors. What it wants to do is provide drug treatment services to up to, initially they say 50% of the prison population. They then adjust that upward and say, we think 90% of your population here has a drug problem. And what we'll do is, if you give us a dedicated wing in this prison, we will take a quarter of your inmates and be responsible for their supervision. We will take them, in effect, off of your hands. And we will have them 24/7. And so administrators are like, this is a no-brainer. So the company gets a grant. They're also going to bankroll some of this. And the agreement between the state and the company is, if after 3 years you think we've done a good job here, you will pay for our services. And the state says, absolutely. The company's philosophy is this: the increases in the size of the prisoner population are a function of a quote-unquote new breed of offender. These are people who are addicted to drugs and addicted to crime, and they suffer from fundamentally a disordered personality. There is something at the root of them that is wrong. And so the company has all these sort of slogans, one of which is, addiction is a function of a diseased self. We don't provide rehabilitation because rehabilitation implies that a person was once whole and fully functioning. We think these people are essentially born bad. So we have to habilitate them. We have to smash their identity and create a new person because that which exists is fundamentally flawed. And so to smash identity, they take over a unit of the prison and they engage in 24-hour surveillance. There is nothing as an inmate that you can do that isn't seen or surveilled in some capacity within this drug treatment program. So if you have diarrhea the night before, everyone's going to know it in your unit that day. It's going to become the subject of a therapeutic talk or a therapeutic confrontation. So the therapy that they provide is therapy that is confrontational, that often relies on verbal degradation and physical degradation to try to just destabilize the self. So when you walk in there, you hear prisoners being called all kinds of names, which I'm hesitant to say on film, which is the first time I've ever had a hesitation about language ever. But like crack whores and crackheads and all, like that's the beginning of it. So let me just give you a sense of kind of a typical day in this program. One of the foundational features of programming was something called an encounter group. An encounter group is where you're identified as being in denial about something, or having lied about something, or having engaged in a behavior that people see as sort of a function of your flawed self. And so you're asked to sit usually on one of those little rolly office chairs. Sit in a little rolly office chair, and all the other inmates will sit in chairs around you. So they form a circle around you, and counselors will be in that circle as well. And then people will just start telling you what's wrong with you. It's led by a counselor, but then other inmates are invited to join in, and often it's no holds barred. So if they don't like the way you look, or how you talk, or your boyfriend, it's going to come out. And the kicker is, you're not allowed to speak. So you have to sit there and take it. And so here's one, and I'm going to read you a more mild one, as I'm cognizant that I've just signed a press release. So this is between Counselor Tenise and a prisoner named Ty. And so Counselor Tenise has put her in the center of the circle and is saying that she is going to address her bad behaviors. Family, I put you in this circle today to give you some information about yourself. You're not in control like you think you are. You ain't got no control at all. And do you know how I know that? At the beginning, she's speaking really low, but by the time she gets to the end of this thing, she's screaming. You ain't got no control. Everybody's leaning forward, and Ty begins to shake. And she says, Do you know why you don't have any control? And Ty starts to stutter. And so she's interrupted, and she says, I asked you a question. Do you know how I know that you're not in control? Dialogue. And so Ty shakes her head. Ty, I instructed you to dialogue, not gesture. I'm going to ask you again, and this time I want an answer. You're not going to control me or this session. You don't have the control that you think you do. Now, I asked you twice, and I'm not asking you again, unless you're truly so dumb or so confused as to not know the answer. I want to know why I know, but you don't seem to, that you're not in control. So Ty responds, and her jaw is just like clenched. I control what I think and how I behave. Isn't that what this program is telling us? That we're responsible for our behaviors? And the counselor says, family, that's it. I've had enough with your attitude. If you had all this control and all this power, would you be in here? What kind of woman, what kind of mother would choose, if she had control, to be in prison? Come on, family, you're talking shit now, and we all know it. And then she goes on, and Ty is starting to sweat. She says, I know you're not in control because I understand the disease of addiction. I know what an addict looks like, feels like, and thinks like. I can read the signs, and sister, they are written all over you. Does this sound like you? You can't deal with your emotions, and you try to control them by taking drugs? And what was yours? Oh yeah, you were a whore for your crack. I remember. You whored around with all those men. You were manipulating all right. But not just them, no. You were repressing those emotions, and as you did, you let crack rule you. You let those men rule you. You manipulated yourself. A whore is helpless, and that is you. And so as she gets to the end of this, Ty, who kind of starts out shaky and then clenches her jaw, is now, like, her shoulders have kind of collapsed in, and she's starting to cry, for which she gets a write-up. It's because she's expressing emotion and she's not officially allowed to in this moment. And so what happens with a lot of these encounters is that they often erupt either into violence in some situations where women end up just throwing chairs or running out of the room or kicking walls or kicking in doors, or more frequently that women end up withdrawing entirely and just trying to get out of the program. They experience high levels of anxiety. And it doesn't really take a lot to go in and observe it and see that it's not effective in any meaningful way. The women don't think it's effective. The prison staff in the institution didn't think it was effective. The only people who thought it was effective were the employees of the private company that were providing the service. And they would say, when women would drop out and say, I can't take it anymore, it's too negative, I already have self-esteem issues, and this is making them worse, and it's making me anxious, the company would say, of course, that's part of the natural process of a diseased self, that they're in denial about it. So of course they'll drop out, and of course they'll say they can't take it because they have a disease. It was this sort of circular logic. All right, so that was one, sort of going in. It was producing a lot of anxiety among the administrative staff, a tremendous amount of anxiety among the prisoners, and then for outside evaluators, of which I was one, we couldn't figure out how this was in any way effective or how this was in any way addressing sort of real problems that women were facing in the institution. And by the way, if you were identified as a drug offender who was eligible for this program, you couldn't participate in any other thing in the prison. Not GED classes, you couldn't go to the law library, you couldn't take, there was only like 2 vocational training programs in the prison, but you couldn't take them. You had to dedicate yourself 100% of the time to drug treatment. And there were also people who were sentenced directly in, so they had no option but to stay in. The second problem is the problem with effectiveness. And so this is what I was doing there, this is what some other people were doing there, was, all right, maybe the company knows better than the rest of us. It doesn't seem like this is effective. They have a high dropout rate. When people are leaving the institutions, they're relapsing. So we began to study this. And sure enough, even among program graduates, there was a very real problem that became pronounced usually within 6 to 12 months of their release. And so the program only graduated about a third of the women, successfully graduated about a third of the women who came in, meaning other women were either kicked out because they engaged in violent behavior as their mechanism to get out, or they wrote to a sentencing judge and managed to get themselves out. Very often they would take more time on their sentence than to finish out this program. So I knew women that would agree to do an additional 2, 3, and in one case 5 years to avoid 1 year in this program. And when I talked to the women about it, they would say, I'm worried that if I stay in this program, they're going to brainwash me. I'm worried that I'm going to lose who I am in here if I stay in. So I would rather take the time and know that I am who I say I am than have them bombard me with all this kind of stuff. So this is Lita's story. Lita was actually a very successful prisoner in the program. She followed the rules. She accepted the fact that she was an addict. She would get up and regularly sort of narrate her life in a way that was consistent with how the company and the program wanted her to narrate her life. So she would take responsibility for things, including her abuse as a child. So she suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child, and the company always said to her, don't be a victim, take responsibility for it. So she would say that she brought that abuse onto herself based on the kind of character that she had, and that she was going to work on that so that she wouldn't be in that situation anymore. So she graduates, and she gets out of prison about 18 months earlier than she would have had she not graduated the program. And she's clean for 6 months. But when I find her, she's relapsed back to crack. And she's agreed to talk to me and to have a conversation and to acknowledge the relapse and to have a conversation about it. So this is what she said. This is their successful program graduate, by the way. This is who they used to, one of the people that they held up at press conferences as an example of programming that was effective. Until I wrote this up. So I'm asking her about her sobriety and all of that. And she tells me that she had, and we're talking also about the relapse. And it's not just a relapse like, oops, there's a little crack, I smoked it. It's like, I'm back in it with the crack. So I'm asking her why, particularly in light of how hard she worked. And she tells me that she's made peace with her quote unquote true self. And she explains, people don't change. They're either bad or good, that's it, heaven or hell. Not much to do once it's been set up. I'm an addict, and the program made me realize that. I can be an addict if I don't use, or I can be walking with the dead, but I'm always an addict. It's who I am. I'm a crack addict. Recovering, it's just a matter of time before a relapse, because you are what you are. My using is just me finally getting honest with myself. Finally. I ain't no princess, not a superstar, not gonna make it big, you know? I'm an addict. Nothing changes that. And that's actually absolutely correct. She took what the philosophy of the program was and embraced it to its logical extreme, which is you're an addict, you always are going to have a defective character flaw that produces the addiction. There is no cure in this company's framework. There is only the ability to sort of manage the addiction. But there's never sort of moment that you're not an addict. And it's great from a profit perspective. And it's great market logic. Because if people are always addicts, their addiction is either in remission or it's active. If people are always addicts, it creates an ongoing market for this company's services because nobody's ever cured, which means when you get out of the institution, you need additional services to supervise and surveil you. And so it's just a growing market. And so here's a woman, and she's not the only one that I talked to who sort of arrived at this conclusion. Another woman who I talk about at the end of the book, Carla, when I go to see her, she's kind of right on the brink. She's still clean, but I go to see her in this like nasty playground where there's broken bottles and I can see like just sort of broken drug paraphernalia around. She's got her 3 kids. She's working a couple of jobs and she's still in the hole economically. So she says to me, yeah, I'm clean, but is anything better in my situation? When I hustled, I had time to spend with my kids. When I was making that money, I saw my kids. I don't see them at all now because I'm working 3 jobs. She was working, in one case, she was working as a maid in the hotel that she used to hustle in. And then she strung together 2 fast food jobs. But she was having now to pay for daycare and having to pay for rent and having to pay for food and is in the same neighborhood with less time. And so she was going, at the moment that I interviewed her on the follow-up, she's going through this sort of existential crisis, which is, in what way am I better off other than being sober? In what way am I better off? And maybe maybe I'm always an addict. So maybe admitting that and then going back to the life is the solution, is getting honest, which is what the program demands. So, how am I doing on time? Is good? Is good. So then the question is, so I go in, see what is wildly problematic and also very clearly not working. And then the question becomes for me as a sociologist, why would the prison adopt this? Why do it? It wasn't popular. The program itself actually wasn't popular among prison administrators. They would walk into those therapy sessions and be chilled and very upset. And very often there were a lot of conflicts between them and the private employees of this company. So why keep it? Because the end of the story is the drug treatment program is there for 3 years, and the state picks it up and funds it. And it's still there today. So there's a couple answers as to why that happens. And it's sort of the perfect storm of variables in some respects. So the first sort of element to the explanation about why adopt a program that fails and why adopt a program that's harsher than what you had in place in the first place and is actually more costly is gender politics. First part of this answer is gender politics. Administrators and line staff in the women's prison were wedded to the idea that women are different, that women have different needs than men, and therefore they did not want to make their institution the same as a men's prison. They really, really, really were resistant to that. And one idea that resonated with them is that women are sick. It's been a long-standing idea that's animated policies in the prison system, that men are bad and women are sick. And so women's prisons have had a history of engaging in control practices that they sort of redefine as being treatment practices. And one of the things most notably is the use, widespread use of pharmaceuticals in women's prisons. And so when women act out in prison, instead of being sent to solitary, they usually get a tranquilizer. And you can go to a women's prison on any given day and see people just sort of sliding down the halls. I mean, it's a lot of prescription drug use. And then, if you don't believe me, you can look in state correctional budgets, particularly in the healthcare line items. And because sometimes the states will complain like, oh, women prisoners are so much costlier because of their gynecology. It's not their gynecology. It's the prescription drugs. They use them much, much more frequently. And again, it's just animated by this notion that women who commit crime do it because they're sick. They don't do it for economic reasons. They do it because they're sort of suffering from some psychological problem. Instead of giving them counseling, let's just give them a prescription sedative. So the idea that women need to be treated was certainly one that had a long history. It had a long history in this particular institution. And so gender politics are a part of what frames this response. And gender politics are sort of the baseline for understanding what's going on here, because it is being packaged as a treatment program, even though we could also broadly see it as an incredibly coercive set of control practices. The second element of the explanation is sort of politics of state bureaucracy. And that is, states have limited budgets. Prison population is swelling across the state. The vast majority of prisoners in the state are men. So the state is dedicating the majority of its corrections budget to building more men's prisons and to hiring more correctional officers to supervise all the men who are coming in. They actually borrowed against future budgets to build that new women's prison. And when it becomes overcrowded, the response from the state DOC is to just blame the administrators at that institution and say, you're overcrowded because your recidivism rates are high. Your recidivism rates are high because you're not doing enough with these women. And so administrators are looking for a quick fix, both to just rid themselves of that population. And if you haven't picked up on this, it's a shell game. So there are still the same number of prisoners in the institution. It's just that care for 25% of them is off-put onto the private company. So it frees up some state resources, but nobody's actually taken out of the institution. It's a shell game. It's bureaucratic politics at its finest. But administrators who are anxious to save their jobs and anxious to save their prison from the incursion of state bureaucrats agree to it immediately. Now, if the recidivism rate's high, it's the company's fault, not theirs. And now if there's fights in the hallway, it's because the company hasn't hired enough staff to supervise people. It's not a function of the state. You grasping that? Third element here is market logic and privatization. And so most of the scholarship on prison privatization that's written over the last 20, 25 years is about the emergence of private prison facilities. That is, brand new correctional facilities that are wholly owned and operated by private companies that the state then pays for them to supervise state prisoners. And that was profitable for a minute. It's not profitable anymore. what this company did is a new wave of prison privatization. It's not profitable for these private vendors to run a whole correctional facility on their own because they were facing a series of Eighth Amendment lawsuits for cruel and unusual punishment. You can't really cut down staff-inmate ratios all that much and not have escapes and not have fights and violence. And so within a 10-year period, it became pretty obvious that private prison vendors weren't doing any better than state vendors or state providers. But where the money is in services to institutions. And so that's what this company was offering, and sort of market logic about a diseased self is one that offers enduring profits. Because it used to be in the prison scholarship, privatization and treatment can't possibly go together. Can't possibly go together because their logics are at odds, which is if you treat somebody and they heal, meaning they don't commit more crime and they don't relapse to drugs, then they're not coming back into the system. And so how do you make a buck off of them? So there's no way to make money in that game. You only make money by creating prisons as these places where people are worse off when they come out than they were when they went in, unless you change the philosophy of addiction, disease, and treatment. Because if you change the philosophy and say that somebody is fundamentally flawed, a population of people are fundamentally flawed, then it's you provide your service in prison, you provide it in community-based correctional facilities, and on and on and on. So this is kind of fantastic net widening where there's always a market for your services, because even if we reduce the size of the prison population, there's an entire demographic group of people who need to be managed and surveilled and supervised because they're always at risk for disorder and crime and addiction. So it is market logic that is really running the game here as the other element of this. That's why women come out in ways that are just so sort of desperate and problematic. And every failure that the company has in terms of a relapse or a woman committing another crime is its success. Because they say, see, the failure proves the theory. The failure proves that the person is fundamentally flawed. So you need us more now. It's completely different than what it would be for administrators, where recidivism rates prove their failure. Now it is, this proves the truth of what we're saying and the truth of our philosophy. It's like evil genius. And then the fourth element in play here is race, very obviously. This program would have been untenable at a moment in time when the majority of prisoners in the state were white women. And in fact, I was sort of there for the shift in the racial demographic in the prisoner population. And when the racial demographic shifted and prisoners became majority Black and Latina, that's where you began to have administrators and staff who were once very critical of the drug treatment program and of the company. That's where they began to shift their own talk. And so they would refer in the sort of era before the drug war, they would refer to women prisoners as good girls. These are good girls who got caught up with usually bad men. They got into a bad situation. They just need some mentoring. They need to know how to sort of regulate their appearance so they attract good men. They need to know how to cook and clean and raise babies, identify the right guy, maybe get a job on the side. But their problem is they attract the wrong men and they're sort of misguided. But they're good girls. They're not bad people. They're not criminals. When the prison becomes majority Black, all of a sudden you have line staff saying, there's a different kind of offender among us today, a real criminal. These are women who are fundamentally different from the people that we've treated in the past. These are the women who are responsible for our recidivism rates. These are the women who are committed to criminal lifestyles. And so for them, this program became much more palatable. When it was happening, when Black women were being confronted by counselors and called dingbats and dumbasses and crack whores, that became a much more palatable set of exchanges and interactions. And in fact, over time, when I went back a couple of years later after the end of the study, you had correctional officers, regular state employees, grabbing women out of the hallway and getting in their face and saying very similar things. You're a crack, you know who you are? You're a crack addict. You're a crack addict in denial. And it was shocking because they were adopting the control practices of those private prison vendors, something that they had never done before. But it was something that for them became much more amenable when the prison population was African American women. I think I want you to talk now about anything you want. I'm going to stop there and let's have a discussion. Yes.
So what was the recidivism range, like at the beginning of study and the end?
It always hovered about.
The same, or did it change substantially?
It always hovered around a 2/3 rate, though there was some variation in reporting. And this was kind of slick too. So sometimes they calculate, so each year the program had to have, see you later, had to have an evaluation report done. I was one of the people who was, one of the researchers who was producing those reports. Sometimes they would survey the women who graduated from the program. Have you committed another crime? Are you using drugs? And they would rely on verbal self-report rather than, say, do a urine test. Now, of course, if the woman was convicted, there's a record of that. But one thing women learned to do very well was recognize that they were going to be stigmatized if they said they had relapsed. So there was sort of these crazy fluctuations when you would look at the results from drug tests versus the results from the surveys. And the company, as quickly as possible, moved to kind of get rid of the drug tests on the premise that drug tests are costly and ineffective and can be manipulated. So let's just go with those surveys. But roughly a 2/3 failure rate. Kelly Welch.
Were you able to identify any glimmer of hope after your research?
No. And that's why I'm in Graterford. And that's why I'm here, because I like it actually, part of the reason that it took me so long to write the book was I had a lot of guilt about it, because I would go to conferences and start presenting this research, and inevitably people in the room would say, what do you want? You want people just locked? So you're going to come in here and critique this treatment program. It's the only treatment program. It's the only game in town. And so you want people just locked up in their cell? Because that's the alternative that we're looking at. And it's a great question. But it's a question that has a flawed premise. And the premise is that treatment and punishment are things that are fundamentally distinct from one another. And my argument here is that actually this is another form of punishment. And the women that I talked to actually quite would have preferred just sitting in their cell. And I think at the end of the day, they would have been better off being able to just go to the GED program or take a vocational training class or sitting there. I think that this did such violence to their own sense of self. So, but it has continued to grow. It's in the majority of states now, irrespective of its actual statistics. So now the game I'm looking at is education programs in prison, of which I am hopeful there. Yeah.
The logic of the free market is real. Are there other companies that are emerging to try to make themselves competitive with these ones that are failing in prison?
What this one does is actually it kind of morphs. So it's like it's kind of like, remember Terminator 2, where where like what's his face like kills the bad guy, and he's little metal he's in molten metal, whatever, and then the metal starts to harden, and then it all like forms. This company, when they get in trouble, because they have been sued a number of times and bumped out of states, but then they usually end up merging with other companies. And they also kind of pick people off like Microsoft does. So when there are vendors who look like they're successful, a lot of times this company will absorb them. But there are a couple different companies in play right now that are in this game, and it's a very profitable one. They were the only ones out there in the beginning. But yeah, there are a few. And, I mean, I don't know. There's certainly no clear winner if you look at the research studies coming out that aren't produced by the companies themselves.
You're still mentally ill.
Right.
You can't lose.
There were women that actually weren't drug users that were in the program because they sold, but they didn't actually use. And so they would say, well, I'm not an addict. Or like the women actually had very different definitions of addiction and problematic drug behavior. So they would say, no, an addict is a person who doesn't take care of their business. An addict is the person who can't get it together and survive on a day-to-day basis. I don't even use drugs. I'm selling them. Like, how am I being constructed as this? But the program would say, well, of course you're not. You're addicted to the lifestyle. Yeah.
Everybody's mentally ill.
I was just presenting like 2 weeks ago, and I had a woman from that end of the game, a sort of psychiatric profession, say like, oh, well, these people are dual diagnosis, which means you have like one addiction plus another set of bad behaviors in essence. And I said, well, that's certainly the rhetoric or a dominant explanation, but the concept of dual diagnosis is so elastic, and I find it hard to believe that we go from 15,000 people in the population who are dual diagnosis to 115,000, roughly 115,000 in a 35-year period. Like, how is, especially if the person is fundamentally flawed from birth, like how would we get that kind of explosion of a flawed personality or an intrinsically bad person? It doesn't make any kind of sense unless it's organized around considerations of profit and politics. Yeah.
But, you know, in AA and NA, on the similar things to AA, they also have that thing about, you know, once an alcoholic, you have to together. And yet somehow this doesn't sound like the same thing. Could you compare and contrast those approaches?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly do borrow from a lot of the rhetoric of NAAA. And they actually, the program itself is modeled after therapeutic community, which if you're familiar with therapeutic communities, some of the earliest ones, the goal was that you would be able to drink alcohol again socially. So there wasn't that kind of absolutist framework where I can never touch a drink. But AA and NA ultimately are voluntary organizations. And I mean, I know that there's dispute in the research literature, like, okay, your family members or your employer can coerce you to go. But the idea that addiction persists, or it's something that you're born with, or an allergy that you've acquired, that's the same. The difference here is that you're being coerced into it, whether you acknowledge that you have a problem or not. That's the fundamental difference. Yeah.
So what were you going to say about Orange is the New Black?
Well, what piece of Orange is the New, like Orange is the New Black actually is incredible to me because of Piper Kerman's sentence, which it is so difficult to get out of a mandatory minimum. So the amount of strings that had to be pulled, so she does 13 months, and she's involved in a major trafficking organization. Again, she's not a major player. Neither, for the most part, is anybody in the prison that I studied. But because the organization is so major, the amount of drugs that she goes down for would have easily gotten another person a 20-year sentence, no question. The fact she's out in 13 months is stunning. I actually am not familiar with any story where it happens that quickly, because there's only two ways you get out of a mandatory minimum. You give up information on other people, or you prove that you are of good character, and that's where you get sort of a parade of people coming in and saying, I'm a nonviolent first-time offender, I was holding down a job. This is sort of the middle class or upper middle class exemption to mandatory minimums. But she's in a minimum security, when she's incarcerated, it's in a minimum security federal prison. And so the inmate population there looks very different than people who are in state prisons. It's majority drug offenders and like minor property crime kind of stuff. Not Martha Stewart, but I think she was in the same institution as Martha. But there's things that are portrayed in there that just would never, the shower scenes, no way. No way anybody's in a group shower with absolutely no supervision. They downplay, there's no sexual violence in the show. And that's not true in state women's prisons at all. And it sort of, sexual coercion in women's prisons runs the gamut from officers outright paying you or giving you in-kind gifts to rape. And inmates participate in that as well. So that always strikes me as a feature of the show that is so strange that it's not kind of part of anyone's fear or concern. But probably consistent with who she was in the institution, because she was a resource person and because it's a minimum security institution. She didn't face the same threats that other women would have faced. Other questions or reactions?
Is there anything that you think is done well in Orange is the New Black?
think the second season, I think the first season was a pilot that was written to get picked up on ABC or NBC, like a major station. So I think the second season is much more interesting because it's given women's backstories, and it gives you some sense of the politics among prisoners. Because prison is an endlessly political place, and there are alliances that shift, and alliances are brokered a lot of times around access to resources. And so I think this season's kind of getting into that. And it's also showing that there's alliances that exist across prisoners and staff, that it's not sort of a neat, tidy little divide among those two categories of people, as those of us who work in Graterford know.
So in other words, this company that you told us about that we cannot know the name of because you will be sued, even though they've merged with other companies, we, the taxpayers, are paying for them currently. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's the biggest crime of all.
Yeah. And there's very little, there's very little in the way of a political will to look at that. And so, one thing that I've been trying to do more recently, especially, now where all of my research started, it was like, oh my God, here's mass incarceration. This is terrible. How are we going to convince state policy makers and taxpayers that this is a terrible plan? Now, 2009, Arnold Schwarzenegger gets up on stage and says, we got to release these nonviolent drug offenders, and is perfectly comfortable doing it. He's not jeopardizing his political career in a way that 10 years ago he'd have been out of office had he said. So one thing that I'm trying to do right now is talk to people and say, wait, before we agreed mass incarceration is a tremendous problem, but before we sort of wholeheartedly embrace its replacement in the form of this kind of coercive therapy, we have to start asking questions about what works and what doesn't work. And so, of course I support releasing right now nonviolent drug offenders. It's a no-brainer. They wouldn't have been in the institution 25 years ago. Most of the women that were in the institution when I was there would have never been sentenced to prison. Never. I was sort of disappointed. I wanted them to be harder, to give me an option in life in case this gig didn't work out. But before we start saying drug treatment, we have to recognize that there are potential problems and pitfalls there. But nobody's asking those kind of questions. And I think as Americans, we're looking for that quick fix. But we can very often find ourselves in a situation where the cure becomes worse than what the disease is. So. Anybody have a prison story they want to share? I do think, just as a pitch for Villanova's program at Graterford, the one thing that consistently comes up in the research literature in terms of reducing recidivism rates are education programs, and literally education programs at every single level. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've actually known about the problems with respect to solitary confinement, the problems in psychological problems, both with respect to mentally ill offenders as well as people who are fine, and then develop issues. We've known that since the early 1970s. And so instead of looking at that research science that has existed since the 1970s and has been consistent, we've actually adopted it on a wide scale. And there's if you're in my punishment class, I know a couple of you are, there's an anthropologist named Lorna Rhodes who wrote an amazing book called Total Confinement, where she looks at those practices in men's institutions, and she's looking precisely at people who are already suffering from mental problems, and what very often they violate institutional rule, and then the response to that is to put them in solitary, where it exacerbates the underlying condition, so they continue to violate rules around self-harm and everything else, and then it extends their time in solitary, as well as men who are sent there for very long periods and then develop problems. She really addresses all of that, and she says at the end of the day, it's fundamentally irrational behavior on the part of the system itself that serves no purpose other than, sort of increasing problems both within the institution and then the people who are coming out. Because when people reach the end of their sentence, they're coming out. So if they just did, a 5-year stint in max, where they've had some of the prisons that I've been to, there's a Supermax in Tams, where there is no human contact at all. When you come out of Tams, you're released onto the street. you do your rec time alone. An officer doesn't, they open just when you go out to the yard, which is like a little dog kennel, but it's automatic. Like the door slides open to your cell, you stand outside the cell door, they close it, then you go over to the automated door for the yard, they open that, you go out there. There is no contact. Those guys come out of TAMs, most of them. But imagine having to navigate life out here once you've been in that kind of stripped down environment. It's incredible. Yeah.
Well, that makes me think about the context for families. You were saying that when one of the inmates was kind of being broken down, they said, "You're a terrible mother." They kind of really attacked her for being, well, a woman and also having children.
Right.
But so I'm thinking about this and how this is supposedly therapeutic, but they get out. So what? And this has incredible repercussions for the community and for the family as well. So I was wondering if some of your follow-up family outcomes, things like that, if you would speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, one thing that was actually happening in the state at the time, and across a number of states, was an effort to actually strip women of custody. Again, on the premise that you're an abusive parent by virtue of the fact that you are no longer supervising your child because you committed a crime and you are going to prison. So what was happening by the late 1990s is that some women were losing custody and had no understanding about how that was happening. And they were losing custody to the state. But the other thing that was happening to families is that families were getting increasingly destabilized. So unless there were, usually it was a grandmother, unless there was a grandmother who had a stable situation, children were getting, in some cases, sent from one foster care home to another. In other cases, are being passed off among different caregivers. But the sort of experiences in the child's life are that every couple of years they're moving to a different school district, and they're in a different household. So it was quite disruptive.
Which increases their likelihood, right, for substance abuse and possibly
Yeah.
later.
Yeah. Now I didn't follow the kids, so so I don't know for sure. But certainly some of the other studies would suggest, like the sort of fragile families studies, that yeah, the problems magnify, and they magnify for communities as well. So very often these women are from the same communities that are missing most of the men who lived in the community, and so there's little in the way of informal structures to hold sort of the integrity of neighborhoods together, except for older people.
How has the narrative of rehabilitation been so discredited? I mean, just sitting here as your average taxpayer, it seems so commonsensical that if people aren't instructed in some kind of vocation while they're in prison, well, what are they going to do when they come out? The same as they were doing before they went in. It just seems so logical and clear. Why is it not? Why is that deemed unsuccessful anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it had to do with cultural shifts that were and shifts in political culture. One thing that sociologists always point to is there's a report that was released in the 1970s called "What Works" by a guy named Martinson, and he sort of so he does this meta-analysis of different studies in prisons, studies of educational programs, studies of drug treatment programs, and group psych programs. He does a kind of quick and dirty meta-analysis and concludes that none of the programs work, and so that they're actually a waste of taxpayer money. Now, it was an interesting conclusion because it wasn't like somehow the programming was costing more than locking people up in cells, right, on a day-to-day basis. So you could take that conclusion and say, well, if treatment programming is benign, then why not adopt a more benign, humane approach if we're not even talking about appreciable differences in cost? But that's not how it was received. So it gets received as, these liberals paraded into the institutions and painted the walls light blue and coddled these criminals, and now and look, like nothing got any better. And so the way that we have to stop crime is to really harshly punish it. But then that creates its own set of problems. But I mean, I think a lot of it comes from that moment. I can remember, I'm sure a lot of you can, well, except for you youngins, but just political conversations about crime where a politician could privately say, because I would be sometimes in these spaces where they would privately say, this is nonsensical, but they would never get up in front of a mic and say that. In front of a mic, it was, yes, let's increase sentence length, let's get rid of programming, or anything else that would make prisons a sort of brighter place. And it was Bill Clinton, his administration, that guts the Pell Grant program. So there had been a number of colleges and universities that were providing education programs in prisons throughout the country. But prisoners have to pay for. They have to find ways to pay for that. So they were cobbling together some grants and some loans, just like everybody else. Clinton guts that, and that means the public universities are out. And so at that point, there is no educational programming in institutions except in instances of private universities that were willing to sort of foot those costs. And yet that's the one thing we know. But in the political theater, it was, wait, I worked so my kid could go to school, and this guy commits a crime and he goes to school. It's that. Even though they're not like the equivalent. You know how long it takes to get a degree at Graterford? It's like 20 years, dudes. So it's like molasses. Joyce.
So in writing your book, is your hope that beyond bringing awareness, is your hope that they will hopefully create a strategic plan to implement so the treatment that they're being treated right now will be rid of, and that they will implement something that's more efficient and effective for the inmates? I mean, what's your hope beyond bringing awareness? I mean, is there some type of solution that can be kind of designed where they can actually not give them crime on top of crime, because actually what's happening is they're getting a double dose of what they're already going through on a daily basis.
I don't have any hope that they have any actual incentive to improve the situation. I think that ideology in that state is so thoroughly embedded in this notion that these women are flawed that I just don't see them as doing anything that would alter that. It's profitable. So, my most immediate thing is stop sentencing people to prison for petty drug offenses and reduce the amount of time that virtually everyone is doing on a drug crime. Because we had drug crimes in 1980, So I would happily go back down to 300,000, and I probably would have been upset about that at the time. But I don't think, in terms of tinkering with the program in the institution, I actually don't have any real hope for that. I think it is flawed from the ground up, and so I wouldn't tinker with it. And again, part of the reason that I'm in Graterford is just a set of theoretical questions about, well, is it different if the service provider is not the institution and not a private prison vendor? So if it's a not-for-profit, and does it matter if the service that's being provided is educational services? Is that going to have some currency that other kinds of programming doesn't? And so thus, there I am.
Is there any difference between the privates and publics in terms of the kind of access that you can get to them?
It's hard to get into prison, period. And there used to be something called the prison ethnography that was an incredibly popular genre of writing for social scientists. And so, like you could, every couple of years there'd be a new prison ethnography, but they were all written in the 1960s and 1970s. What those ethnographers did was criticize those prisons, and they were all public prisons that ethnographers went into, but very often, like, wardens were open to it. In that particular moment, people were trying to figure out what works, what doesn't. So a social scientist is coming in for free to study your institution. Yeah, like, have at it. But the reports that got produced often indicted the administration. And so there's, wardens and the State Department of Corrections, they're not under any obligation to further social science research. So it had the effect of just freezing out social scientists from prisons, period. And so there really aren't ethnographies that get produced or any meaningful, like, interior prison studies until more recently, and there aren't even a lot of them. So Louis LeQuant had a student, Megan Comfort, who sets out to go into a California prison and can't get in, and ends up just sitting in the visitors' waiting room and decides to make that her dissertation study. But private vendors don't have to have us in. Public vendors or public providers don't either. So then you kind of like jock your way in by hook or by crook. And so, in Illinois, I was a court-appointed monitor. That the entire Illinois prison system came under judicial supervision for unconstitutional conditions, and then I get hired as one of the people that the court is using to monitor conditions in the Illinois prison system. I don't tell anyone in Illinois, oh, I'm going to write down what I see here. And I'm still not 100% clear on the legality of that. And so thus I haven't published it yet, waiting till I'm close to retirement, which obviously is quite a long way off. And this is also true at Graterford. So you know, it's if the DOC wants to agree to a study, okay, can I write about my private experiences at Graterford? You know, but yeah, it's very, very difficult unless you're doing it in the service of the institution. Do you want to hear something really sleazy? I mean, it's sleazy. It's like sleazy research story. So the private company that is providing these programs across the country understands that it's got to have research studies that get produced out of it in order to enhance its credibility, and that they can't do those studies in-house since there's been more scrutiny of the company's history. So what they do is partner with researchers, not unlike myself, where they say, we'll help you. So the researcher would apply for a grant from, say, NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse. So that's taxpayer dollar. So the company says, we've got an experimental program. It's hot, hot, hot. We will support you in your quest to get a NIDA grant. So the researcher who gets incentives from their university and gets incentives from their discipline, the researcher's like, I got a lock on this. I'm going to get publications out of it because the program hasn't been seen before. I'm going to have access that nobody else is going to have. So I'll get the grant. The grant's not coming from the company. I will do an independent study of it, but with the understanding that the company won't give me the access that I want if I produce a bad study. It's this really interesting little synergistic relationship. And when I first started, so I was at a university. When I first started doing the evaluation studies, nobody told me. I thought I was actually just doing research. I thought people really wanted to know how things were going in the program. So I would produce these evaluation reports that would get circulated to the warden of the prison, to the vice president of the company, and to the researcher who I worked for at the university. And the first evaluation report, I was talking about these encounter groups and how women were experiencing tremendous anxiety in advance of the encounter group. And they immediately moved to have me fired. And I was like, but no, I can show you my field notes. It's good data. I absolutely, I was neutral, and I wanted, and I realized, they don't want to know what's going on, idiot. And I actually managed to stay, but they changed how the reporting went. So it was, the report goes to the vice president of the company. The report goes to my university supervisor, the vice president of the company, and only after it's been vetted a couple rounds does it get shared with the warden of the prison. And my co-researcher got hired by the company and makes about $300,000 more a year than I do. She's down in Texas because there's plenty of prisons in Texas, and therefore endless programming to study. I see her on Facebook. She's living well, dude. She's living well.
So back to the rehab programs and that horrible study that found they were no good. That's it? So they're really not, then it really don't work? I mean, or do you see any rays of hope when people are given better treatment?
I mean, there is variation in in data coming out about treatment programs, because not all treatment programs are alike, and it matters what context they're in. So programs in community-based settings are often better than programs in institutional settings, but we're also dealing with a different offender population. And there's variation in reporting and how studies are conducted. But a lot of times, with respect to treatment and punishment, that 2/3 failure rate is a consistent number. It's hard to get up off of that.
The 2/3 what?
Failure rate. So about 2/3 of people go in will relapse or recidivate.
Well, I guess it's more of a huge structural problem within the economy and the country and the psychology and then with the profit motive in the background and the neoliberalism. I mean, it's all been big horrible plot.
Right. Well, and now, I mean, now it's like you have a very, the clock is ticking the minute you get out that gate. So it's, you got to pay people back who supported you, who sent you commissary money and all that. You gotta pay your rent. You have to eat food. You're trying to get a job, but employers can discriminate against you based on your conviction. And so it's you don't have much time, and if you don't have resources already, it's a much shorter clock. So people that I know a number of people right now who are out, who are doing reasonably well, but they've still got hustles on the side, and they have to, because the fix is sort of in from the beginning, and these are people who didn't have drug problems. Yeah.
So, when this company first initially approached this, anonymous prison and had this rationale of people who are women, inmates, addicts are inherently bad people, what did they use to support their argument? How were they? I mean, I know what the real reason was for the argument was profit, right. But how did they trump up this, theory and present it in a logical argument to a prisoner?
They actually, they would institute these cross-training programs because they would tell correctional officers were resistant, line staff was resistant, and so they would say, we have to educate these people. You're not used to dealing with addicts. They're just coming into your institution now. This is what we do. So let us tell you about the addict. They would have all these little graphics. One was a graphic that reminded me of if you have a dog and you get that ads for tick, tick prevention, and it shows the life cycle of the tick. It goes in a circle. There was this graphic, and I have it in the book, where it's poor parenting, acts out, acting out behavior doesn't result in discipline, and then it's acts out more, engages, has first contact with criminal justice system, goes out, uses drugs, comes into a treatment program, relapses, and it's like this, and then it'll say has babies, and so it's like the larvae tick cycle. They would present that at these sessions. But the other thing that they did is that they would, for this company, they started their session with pictures of Attica. So Attica was prior to the New Mexico prison riot. Attica was the biggest prison riot in the history of the states. And what they said, they had a sort of unique take. Attica was a political event, I mean, really, fundamentally. But in the company's presentation of Attica, which would feature these images of inmates rioting in the yard and this dead an image of this dead correctional officer, what they would say is that the problem of Attica was that it was the beginning of mental illness in the prisons. And then they would talk about, here's the mentally ill people. We don't have a public mental health system anymore. They're now flooding into the system. And so what you're going to get ultimately is violence. And the sort of racial tropes that were in play there were quite pronounced as well. And so you're presenting it to predominantly white correctional officers, images of black men rioting in a prison yard, and saying interpreting the riot as being about access to mental health services, which is was one of the platforms that prisoners were asking for at Attica, among other things, also educational programming, also not being brutalized by correctional officers. But they just distilled it into that one thing and said, this is the logical outcome of what's going to happen. That's how they sold it. They didn't sell it on research studies. The extent to which they pulled data in was to say, here's your recidivism rates. People are coming out of your institution and relapsing because you're not doing anything with them. And one of the most damning things they did was they surveyed a number of prisoners from that institution who admitted they used drugs in the institution. Now it's the institution, so now the institution just wants to shut them up because, the other threat is we'll take the survey public. That's how they sold it.
For this institution you're talking about, I noticed how, say for Ohio, for instance, they have it set up where the Ohio, what do they call it now? Ohio MHAS, I think that's what they call it now. They kind of act as a check and a balance system for the prison institutions there, so that some of that stuff won't go on. Not that they're perfect, but
yeah.
So some of that stuff won't go on to that extent. Does that happen
One thing that the company did, which was also politically savvy, is that they would employ usually 1 or 2 counselors who were former prisoners. In fact, that was the best job. If you could get a job in treatment services when you were coming out, those women had the best success rates in terms of being like not relapsing to drugs and having a stable source of income. So the conversation that I read earlier in the talk, Counselor Tanise was a former prisoner. And so they would sort of do that and say, well, we need to have counselors who are professional counselors, who are book educated, and we need counselors from the street because these addicts will fool, quote unquote, book educated counselors. And that could have been a really progressive thing to have done, except that the company was so hierarchical that those street counselors had very little room to move in terms of critiquing policies. And there were moments where they did. There was a conference that I was at that the company had sent a number of their counselors to go to. It was a federal, I don't think it was NIDA, but it was some federally sponsored conference. And the vice president of the company gets up and is talking about treatment services and says, these Negroes. And the 2 counselors that I was sitting with were black. And it was like this, and he was a white dude. And it was like this moment where one of the counselors was Tanise, and she's like, Negroes. Didn't anyone tell him that we're not going by that name anymore? And it led to the beginning of a racial critique of the company, but it never went anywhere because she had no power to sort of ultimately challenge. So he may have lost her in that moment, but not really. Like she wasn't able to kind of say, look, I think that a lot of what's going on here is you're selling a coercive therapy program on a set of racial stereotypes that are palatable to white lawmakers and a predominantly white public. But she didn't get quite there, and she would have lost her job had she said it. But it was so clear. And because most of the people at the conference are white, nobody even notices. Yeah.
So I know you said up front you weren't going to name the company or the state for fear of, legal action, but I mean, I would think they obviously know that this book is out there. So have you faced any types of threat or backlash or fear of retaliation because of how this book is going to make certain players look at people, put 2 and 2 together, and figure out who you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, no, I haven't that I'm aware of. Although, why would anyone tip me off? The company does have a history of suing whistleblowers. They've done it quite a bit because they also provide health services, and there have been inmates who have died as a result of some of their questionable healthcare decisions, and people have come forward. And so, to my knowledge, no, not yet. And they have morphed a couple of times. They've gone through at least 2 morphs since I was there, in that they have absorbed other companies and been absorbed at least 1 or 2 other times. I talk a lot about administrators in here, and actually I have administrators didn't quite understand that I was studying them too. So when I came in and said, I want to study this program and what's happening in prison, they assumed that I was talking about prisoners. And a lot of the book is about them. But that was their assumption that I just simply didn't correct. But most of those people who shared what they shared are all retired now. But that was a concern I had because it's obvious, like the warden of the only women's prison in this state, is immediately identifiable, but he's gone. So it did contribute to the foot dragging on the writing process. I mean, but I joke about being sued, but the other realistic thing too, and I've gone back and forth with other researchers because there's a trend in ethnography now where it's like you should name names, and one of my reviewers for the book came out and said like, oh, listen, you're complicit in this. If you don't name their name, you're complicit in this, and that you're letting them get away with this. But I actually think that it's a sort of flawed premise. Like I could have named names, and the book wouldn't be out, and I'd be shut down, and that would be the end of it. It's not just about this company. It's about a set of practices that are politically palatable. So if this company isn't providing it, other companies will, and I would rather have people read about it and then, as taxpayers and as citizens, go to their legislators and say, what are we doing in the prisons? Is it these kind of practices, and are they effective? As opposed to me kind of naming this company. And I'm worried that that this also, like naming names, it just shuts down prison ethnography again for another 20-year period. So that's kind of my philosophy on it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I didn't read the book, but
Everyone should read it.
yeah.
And buy it, most importantly.
You wrote the book, and you could be sued, and you're kind of worried that people will stop the prison ethnography from happening. So I'm just wondering why. Why did you write the book? What made you want to write the book? Why did you do it?
I mean, it really did take a long time to write because I really wasn't sure. And at the very end, there were times, like when I went back for the follow-up study, there was a woman, I go into the institution and I see her, and I had known her from 4 years prior. And I'm like, oh, hey, what's up? And she, we're like talking. She's like, what, what'd you do? I'm like, oh, I got my PhD, da, da, da. I'm like, what about you? What do you? She's like, no, I'm still here. I'm like, oh God, it was just this really crazy moment. And then there were other people that in the follow-up, literally I went to a house with a woman who was so high. So I go in there, she was thin when I knew her, and she's like skeletal when I'm there, and she's so high that I can't even understand some of what she's saying. And it was so devastating that there's a way in which I didn't want to write it and expose it, because people are in so much pain. But then it's also like, people are in so much pain. You have to talk about it and explain why that exists. So, I guess that's the sort of one element potentially of optimism that I have with it, is that it does allow women's stories to get out there. That was one thing that people said to me again and again and again, like, get my story out. They wanted, and this is another crazy thing about IRBs and institutions. So when you're an ethnographer, you have to get IRB permission to go out and study human subjects. And one of the requirements in my IRB was that I not use anybody's name and that I protect their anonymity. Most women in this book who are prisoners want their name used. And in some cases, they want their name used as a record that they existed and that they mattered, and so that their children could look at that and say, look, here's this positive, regardless of what my mother did, here she made a difference in this study, and here she's featured in the study, and I wasn't allowed to use their name. But at least, hopefully they will recognize themselves, and hopefully their stories matter.